observe incredulously the meteoric rise of museum development in China. And the last rumored estimate was 300 new museums to be built annually there. And that number, the number that are private museums is unknown to me. And of course, the growth of museums of private collectors that have emerged from the shadows of their sister public museums in Latin America to franchise museum models being imported in parts of the Saudi Arabian Peninsula. And all of these are a beacon to an enlightened pathway of how we are evolving as a global museum community and as a reflection of museum origins in the United States. But the question persists like a pebble in a shoe: what is sustainable? U.S. museums offer a rich range of hybrid models adapting to new realities. Some have closed, others merged, while others have rewritten their original founders' intent to survive, and they still have a long way to go to reach their full potential. A work in progress for over a century. And while I often resist the urge to be like a parent and convey wisdom to children that often goes unheeded, I hope you will spare me the indulgence in this brief introduction. One of the most frequent questions we are asked at the American Alliance of Museums is how one can start a museum. Of course, we prefer not to say don't, because our growth is important and demonstrates our value to improve the quality of people's lives and the well-being of communities. But rampant growth without a plan or clear sense of direction can be chaos. So we suggest those inquirers to proceed with caution with a few words of advice and questions. What is it you can offer that people want? First and foremost, museums derive their value as a unique social enterprise that generally uses objects to meet human and social needs. The needs and interests of a sole founder to showcase a personal collection as a means to elevate status will be short-lived and ill-prepared to adapt to ever-changing needs and community priorities. This has been particularly true in the United States, where 75% of museums are not-for-profit organizations, exist as a public service, and are not solely funded by government. And the most successful museums in this regard inspire staff, board, and other stakeholders in a shared ownership of mission, vision, and long-term goals. Secondly, is anyone already doing what you want to do? Museum startups, and that includes museum collections of private donors, need to assess the market. If someone is already doing the mission that you love, it might make more sense to widen the circle and partner with them. One can use their resources to extend their mission or broaden their reach. Museums could have the existing resources, audiences, and infrastructure in which to build upon. Thirdly, what will it cost? Many startups underestimate what it costs to run a museum. There may be money for planning and construction and little or no financial resources to pay operating expenses indefinitely or the salaries of staff that are properly trained to carry out the public mission. Typically in the US, the income mix is 24% government funding, 36% philanthropic dollars, 28% earned revenue, and 12% investment income. A diverse portfolio of assets will in the long run have a greater return than the reliance on a sole source of income from one private donor or revenue stream. In my travels globally, human capital is where I see the greatest need, challenge, and opportunity, particularly in rapidly developing museum communities. In some cultural contexts, the museum profession carries little esteem, credibility, or value. Consequently, career staff are underpaid and ultimately burn out or take umbrage under the protection of government employers that may extinguish any spark of creativity and imagination. High-performing museums reward talent and invest in developing their staff. More broadly, my observation on the national museum community development here and other parts of the world reveals that there is still much fragmentation among our ranks. More closer to home, many regional U.S. museum communities that I have visited through my work with as host of the AM annual meeting aren't really communities at all, but more like independent nation states battling over the same turf for scarce resources. This hardly makes them chivalrous or generous. Self-interest may win the battle, but lose the war. Unfortunately, we simply have not learned enough about the power of collaboration in our programs, exhibitions, and collections, and its ability to generate wealth exponentially, which can be shared within our communities, countries, and between countries. And we have yet to find a shared common language and unified message on our value that is palpable to others. Until we can change the conversation with our many stakeholders on how we want to be defined as a museum community, as opposed to being defined by other agendas, our power will never be fully realized. I hope from our conversation today on trends from around the world, we can generate a dialogue that embraces change, experimentation, and risk, so that we might look at our museums and professional museum community anew, and how we can continue to make it matter. To cast an eye on the changing museum landscape in the US, Latin America, and China, our three panelists. Jimena Varela is Director of the Arts Management Program in the Department of Performing Arts at American University. She has been a researcher, educator, and consultant with more than 20 years of experience in international cultural policy, management practice, marketing strategy, arts management research, and sustainable development. She has worked with international organizations, national and regional governments, city agencies, as well as private and nonprofit organizations in arts funding and arts policy. And currently she serves on the board of the Arts and Humanities Council of Montgomery County and has been a board member of the Latin American Institute of Museums since 2000. Andres Nevia is director of the Art Museum of the Americas. During his tenure, he's revamped the mission of the museum by tailoring its cultural programming toward advancing the Organization of American States' institutional branding needs through contemporary art. He also developed social outreach programs to engage the museum in youth violence prevention. Mr. Navia restructured the museum's operations and regulations, updating managerial procedures and standards. He is now focused on identifying a long-term partner to secure the museum's sustainability and the conservation of its valuable permanent collection. Before joining the OAS, Mr. Navia worked for 7 years at the Inter-American Development Bank in cultural sustainable tourism programs in the Maya region and youth violence prevention programs in Central America. He is a graduate of Georgetown University School of Foreign Service, where he obtained his MA, and from the University de los Andes in Bogota, where he obtained a BA in political science, which include a year at Boston University. And Ms. Lily Lee has led the development and international outreach division of the EU1 Society. On the business side, she led successful joint ventures and has also been involved in cultural exchange and exhibition management and consultancy, including helping with the Beijing Olympics cultural events, the Shanghai World Expo, and other major events. She has also planned, consulted on, and managed international conferences and international artist programs. So to begin with, we'll start with Jimena.
Thank you. Thank you. You've done conferences. All right. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. And it's, as I told Dean when we first discussed this, I am so happy to have this conversation here in Washington, D.C., to be able to be here and talk about what's going on in museums in Latin America is a dream come true, because it used to be a fluke. And I used to have to slide it into conversations about other important museums and places. So it's really, really delightful to see it on the forefront of a conversation in DC. So thank you for doing this. What I'm going to talk about is provide the broad background of museum transitions and museum evolutions in Latin America over the past 20 years or so. It overlaps with the period of time that I've worked in museums in the region and the changes I've seen in museums in the region, and map out the landscape of public museums versus private museums, and also take you through what some of the modalities of private museums are in Latin America. And it's a very different landscape from what we think about here in the United States between a public and a private museum. So bear with me, because I'm going to have to do a tiny little bit of history about this. Not that long ago, in the 1980s, when we were all young and hip, there were two simultaneous processes going on in Latin America. One was an economic transformation. This was the time of neoliberal economic reforms, which meant basically a move towards privatization. What that meant was a contraction in the budgets, in the national budgets of countries in Latin America. And that meant that the first budgets to go were, of course, defense. No, I'm kidding. Arts and culture, right? So arts and culture were the first budgets to go, and the first institutions that were affected were, of course, museums, right? And all sorts of strange, weird things happened in this period, because you can't fire a civil servant. You have to put the civil servants that you're taking from services that are eliminated, for example, contraction of the airline or the train services, and put them somewhere. And guess where they went? They all went to museums. So museums became the graveyard of still living, civil and public servants in the entire region. And I worked in Uruguay with several of the national museums, where about 50% of the employees of the National Anthropological Museum were trained employees. About 30% of the employees in the National Museum of Fine Arts were former airline employees. Right? And I bring this up because this is, just for starters, is really different from what you would find here in the United States, right? You wouldn't find people from one industry completely being sent, en masse to another one. But one of the interesting things to note when you're looking at national museums and public museums in Latin America is seeing how did they handle this? And some of them incorporated that personnel in very clever and innovative ways. For example, the National Museum of Uruguay, Fine Arts, set the people in charge of baggage claims to then be in charge of collections management. Right, and collections tracking. They trained stewardesses to be docents, right? And the graphic designers of the airline became the graphic designers for the museum. So it's a way to capitalize on people's knowledge and skills and give them a second lease on a career in public service. Other museums have not been as smart as that, and some of them have a room that's designated to the trained people. Or the roadworks people, where they go and spend the day, and then so that the kind of innovation that you see in public museums that you wouldn't expect, because they're very much underfunded, they don't have a lot of resources or access. Some museum directors have been very smart in really looking at the human resources that they have to work with and retraining them and giving them these new roles. So this is one thing, the economic crisis. Now the economic crisis and the neoliberal reforms gave rise to not just a contracted state budgets, but also to this new class of newly rich, especially young professionals, many of them who had come to the United States to get their MBAs, returned and grew their own businesses, many of them in knowledge industries, but also in some kinds of manufacturing. So you have these young 30-something, now 40-something, still young entrepreneurs in the region who suddenly have a lot of money and begin collecting art. Right? So let's think about these two processes at the same time. Right? The economy affecting the contraction of state museums, but also this class of newly rich, young, professional, highly educated people interested in collecting art, and especially in collecting contemporary art. Right? From Latin America, but also from other places. One of the most important private collections in Mexico has works from Cy Twombly, Jeff Koons, etc. But many of them interested in collecting Latin American contemporary art. The second kind of transition was the democratic transition. So by the end of the 1980s, most of the countries in Latin America had either returned to democratic government or began a democratic experiment for the first time. This is really important because, well, obviously, but in terms of museums, because the mandate of museums changed. Museums became in many, many places, were places at the vanguard of inclusion, of social inclusion, for example, of indigenous peoples and indigenous rights, right? Of inclusion of the Afro populations and the shift from, for example, the African collections from ethnographic museums to museums of art and museums of history. So this complete change in mindset of where people belonged and where people's art belonged happened as well. So there's a whole group of museums in Latin America, and this is a significant chunk of them, that are aligned with social movements, with social inclusion, social access, and that also translates into the move towards museum education. So there's extraordinary movement in museum education in Latin America, and probably the best ones at this, and they have an extraordinary network, are the museums in Chile with the DBAM network. So that's where that comes from. There was tremendous growth starting in the mid-1990s until today in the museum sector. Not like China, not 300 museums a year, but pretty substantial. Well, actually, I should do the math. From about 2,000 museum and heritage institutions that were identified by the Latin American Institute of Museums, ILAM, in 2000, there's now over 7,000 sites. Now, a note about that. A note about definitions. When we think of museum, we often think of a building with a collection, right? Or perhaps a virtual museum with a virtual collection. In Latin America, the classification is a bit broader, right? It includes museum plus heritage, and this may be natural heritage, cultural heritage, or a combination of the two. Because there are parks, trees, rivers that have cultural meaning as well, and those are treated in many cases as outdoor museums, right? So that's another important consideration to think about. So what have been the changes? I'm doing okay for time, right? Okay, good. All right. So what have been the major changes more recently? One has been, and I'm going to take this into two sections. One is the public sphere and the other is the private sphere. In the public sphere has been a shift in these museums that used to count on a steady budget from the government, which, by the way, was never that much to begin with. All right, so these cuts are significant, but there never was that much money devoted to arts and culture museums anyway. A shift towards sponsorship, so public-private partnerships with institutions. For example, one project I worked on with the National Museum of Anthropology was with a dairy company, where the dairy company would subsidize visits by the entire public school system, children from the public school system, to the museum, and would also give them a little package with 2 cookies and a little bottle of milk when the kids came, as long as we could match that with funds that we earned and raised from the private school system. Right, which was the wealthier system, obviously, in the country. So many of these public-private partnerships on the such a small scale, like 2 cookies and a bottle of milk, to very large kinds of partnerships with more involvement from a corporation and more of a marketing, PR, promotional kind of standpoint. There's also been challenges in innovation. So many of the countries in Latin America, their ministries of arts and culture, have joined together with ministries of tourism to provide challenge grants for museums to develop specific programs, usually geared, yes, towards economic development, urban regeneration, and attraction of investment into the country. Excuse me. So in the private sector, there's 3 big groups of private museums. One kind of private museum are the private collectors, so these young, wealthier usually businessmen, though there's some women, who begin to collect art and establish their own museums. And the prime example is the Colección Constantini in Buenos Aires, created by Eduardo Constantini, and the other is, I always say this wrong, so I wrote it down, it's the Fundación Colección Jumex in Mexico, established by Eugenio Lopez in 2001. He is the heir to a multimillionaire fortune of juice producers. And these are the 2 giant vanguard institutions and really collectors of Latin American art with beautiful facilities, with all sorts of really neat programming, very spiffy looking kinds of places. So that's one kind, right? So young, Constantini dead now, but the ones who are there are young. Private collections, usually in contemporary art. The second kind of private museums are artists, collections started around the life and work of an artist. And one of my favorites in this case is the Lázaro Segal Museum in Sao Paulo. And these are museums created by the artist to house their work, or by the people who were students of this artist, who then raised the funds to create these museums. There's a number of really beautiful ones all over Latin America, and these are usually sustained by friends societies. So it's not membership organizations, but it's, let's say, the four of us get together to support the creation of this museum, and we do the work of getting corporate sponsorships, partnerships, earned income, and the rest. So this is another kind of model. And the third kind of museum, and this is the one that's in tension with the public museum system, are the corporate museums. And most often these are bank museums. So the bank and the Bank Santander, for example, has a museum and cultural center. Bolivia has several banks that have museum systems and cultural systems, so Banco Bolivia, of course, but the Bank of Santa Cruz as well. The Central Bank Museum of Costa Rica, the Museum of the Bank of the Republic in Colombia. There's many of these bank museums. And if you think back to my story about the neoliberal economic reforms and the toll that likely took on society and how people might have felt about banks and bankers, it's not surprising that it would be the banks that do this kind of thing, because they do a lot of not social work, but socially directed cultural programming and the rest. Now, why is the tension? Well, because the banks, the kinds of collections that they have are, for example, the gold collection, which matches their mission, right? Because it's coins, gold, value. But in many cases, it's also in all cases, it's part of the cultural heritage of these nations, right? So there's a certain tension about who it should be that should have these collections under their care. Should it be a nationalized museum, or should it be a corporate museum and bank? And the other tension has to do with the fact that the curators in some of the bank collections are not necessarily trained in the tradition that they would be in normal museum institutions. And there's a little bit more of a bent towards the spectacular, the showy. So this is not a bad thing. It's just the tension, okay? It's taken as like, well, it's not serious scholarship, right? They're about, like being really glitzy and they're bringing in, one of the biggest debates was in Sao Paulo, Brazil a few years ago, where banks were bringing in set designers to design the exhibitions in their private collections. Who does that? Innovative people. But still, this went very much against the grain of the traditional exhibition preparators, curators, and the rest, right? So that's a tension. And the final feature of the museum world in Latin America has to do with networks. And disclaimer, I'm part of one of them, so I have to disclaim, there's two really powerful networks of museums in Latin America. One is DIBAM, which I mentioned before, is the Directorio de Bibliotecas, Archivos y Museos, the Directory of Libraries, Archives, and Museums in Chile, which is the public museum system. It's about 200 museums, almost 200 museums in Chile, and they've devoted the past 15 years to really working hard on museum education, particularly museum education for children, and they're extraordinary in providing training for them. The other is the Instituto Latinoamericano de Museos, ILAM.org, Latin American Institute of Museums, ILAM.org. And that is the network that I'm on the board of. It's a network of over 7,000 museums, cultural heritage sites, and natural heritage sites in Latin America. And they provide training in conservation, in preventative conservation. So, for example, one thing that we do is go into communities where there are objects that may be in danger of being either stolen or destroyed, and training lay people, right, on how to preserve these objects. And it also provides training via virtual training through the network, through the ILAM network. So those are the things I just wanted to leave you with. These two giant forces of change, economic change and democratic change and political change, that led to this really incredible new world of museums in Latin America. There's lots of innovation happening. And although I think we don't have the same, just as you were saying for the US, there isn't the sense of a community among the museums. I think the network kinds of connections are a little bit more present.
Andres.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to talk a little bit about the OAS. I hope that most of you are familiar with the museum, but we are a department of a larger institution, the Organization of American States. As some of you know, it's the oldest regional organization dedicated to democracy and human rights and development, protection and improvement. The OES resulted from the Pan American Union. This was prior to World War II. And then it evolved, it incorporated more countries from Latin America and the Caribbean. And the original structure of what we have today is the result of the Cold War era. And this is strongly related to the origins of this museum. This museum was originated in a visual arts program, which was somehow aligned with the U.S. policy on developing cultural exchange with Latin America, somehow to combat communism on one side, but on the other hand, to get to know each other. And it was like an honest approach to more like exchanges not only in the arts, but in education and sciences. So it had this dual purpose. Also, the origins of this museum and the visual arts program was related to economic interests of large American corporations like IBM. Our most important pieces, or some of the most important pieces, were donated by them. Also, this museum was highly or strongly involved in the ESO art salons. ESO is, I don't know if most of you are familiar, it's a Standard Oil, US Standard Oil, which today is Exxon. And anyway, so this whole link to cultural diplomacy still is strongly present, especially in our permanent collection. Nowadays, after the Cold War ended, the whole situation for the museum has changed as well. The political relevance of cultural exchange somehow diminished, and I dare to say that in the 80s and 90s, the museum went through a recession period that varied a lot depending on the Secretary General or what was going on with the leadership within the museum. For example, we had a Secretary General who was strongly interested in the arts, Cesar Gaviria. He was an art collector, and he gave new energy to the museum and new life. But still within this difficult environment of getting more institutional support from the organization and from the member states. This historic link to the Cold War somehow influenced the nature of the permanent collection, which specializes in abstract expressionism. There's an evidence of very little presence of art that is politically or socially engaged. And but we have to admit that this was the golden era of this museum. This was the moment in which the museum amassed its very valuable permanent collection. And since then, since the end of the Cold War, the collection has not grown significantly, and the political value of the museum declined. So now, in the past years, there's a resurgence of the need to engage the museum socially and politically in other ways. And we view this not as a need to survive only, but also to make a connection to or affiliate the museum to the reality of connecting the arts to political and social messages that question and give new relevance to matters that have not been resolved in terms of human rights, of freedom of expression, of democracy, and this is something that we are trying to make more relevant in our exhibits, as this one, for example, which has a strong content on the issue of border crossing between Mexico and the United States, or the exhibit we have downstairs, which has a strong connection to femininity and how it can question the issue of all the feminist movements, and sometimes trying to make this social phenomena reach a point of edgy questioning. And as you mentioned in my summary, we have to link the museum to the mission of the OAS, not serving as a propaganda instrument, but capturing this global aspects of human rights and democracy and development and justice. Now I come to the topic of the conversation today, which is partnership. We have made a tremendous effort in bringing the museum back to the media, back to the attention of academics, refreshing the permanent collection with new views, younger curators that are exploring it again and presenting it in other new ways. And I believe we have succeeded, but the core problem is still there. Like our lack of political relevance to our governing body, which is the Permanent Council composed of 34 ambassadors, has somehow indicated that due to the financial crisis of the OAS, the museum has to become self-sustainable. And so this is the challenge that we're dealing with. We have gained more support from the ambassadors. This mandate of defunding the museum still persists, but we're creating this club of ambassadors that are protecting the interests of the museums. Their ambassadors are very sensitive with the assets that the museum has. The fact that having a museum and a permanent collection can also be associated to prestige. I think that is one of the reasons that this big institutions also have collections. It's something that brings respect and prestige to any institution. But we still haven't managed to become self-sustainable, of course. We have increased our visitation levels slightly because we don't have a marketing budget. And we view a partnership with an educational institution, a foundation, or a museum, private or public, as the only means of continuing with the legacy of the museum. And most importantly, and that's like my very personal concern, is making our permanent collection viewable and enjoyable by the public. The museum, unfortunately, is not able to serve the overall public, and we need outside help in terms of funding and expertise. We are also craving to engage the Latino community. Historically, the museum has not engaged Latino artists in its collection or in its exhibition programming. That is changing in the last years, but we definitely want to engage that into our whole collecting practice and exhibition programming, and somehow make it more relevant to the reality of Washington, D.C. and the United States. So it would be great to have the opportunity to discuss options. The situation is not easy. We're political. We have member countries that are very proud of the ownership of the museum, the collection. It's predominantly Latin American. The natural partner would be an institution in the United States. Geographically, that would mean that it could be in the Washington, D.C. area. but this has a tremendous political cost for the member countries. Like, why give ownership to just one member state of the museum? So we have to be very careful and look for a balance. We have to open ourselves to options in Latin America in terms of partnerships. But the whole issue is of money and a little bit more of technical expertise. We are definitely understaffed. I believe the staff of the museum does a wonderful job, but there's only 5 of us, and because of the assets we have, the responsibility we have with the legacy of the museum and what it means and meant to the concept of Latin America, Latin American art. The creation of this concept is strongly related to the history of this museum. So it would be wonderful to continue with this legacy and find a partner that somehow makes us accomplish our mission more effectively. So thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody. As my English is not very well, so I speak Chinese. Henry translates for me. Are you okay? Sure. Thank you. Yeah. 很高兴今天有这么一个平台，让我们来讨论关于这个museum 和这些我们能够如何的合作和如何的来搭配。
It is a great pleasure for me to represent one of the earliest and largest private art museums in China, to be here and to talk about the public and private partnerships around the museums and also the collection field here in the United States.
我大概简单介绍一下金台艺术馆在中国的。
So I would like to start from beginning to introduce a little bit about our private museums in China.
金台艺术馆是建立在1994年，然后开馆是1996年，到今天是18年。
So the museum started by the artist, but also he's the standing member of a Chinese Political Consultative Conference, Professor Yuan, and the museum opened in 1994.
我们也经过了18年的过程，然后我们也找到了一些方法。那么从开始建馆到现在，我们是100%从建馆一直到现在自己自给自足和一直营运，到现在是自己出资。
From the 18 years experience, we all sustained our operations and permanent collections from self-funding. So we didn't receive any government funds and budgets. And our foundations and societies sustain the whole collections and operation of the museum by itself.
刚才就像那个馆长讲到的，的确是一个艺术馆，它的生存和它需要的资金和它的这个合作者是非常非常重要的。如何让你能够生存下去，这是我们最开始建馆的时候就开始面临的最大的问题。
So one of the critical challenging that we first started the museums in China is how we can identify the right partners, especially the private partners, to sustain the permanent collection and also to make sure that the programming is right for a certain audience in the capital city in China.
那我们就开始打破了传统的博物馆，就是寻求这个合作者的帮助，因为这个资金是不是太确定的。那么我们就开始自己来铲雪，自己来生存。
But due to some uncertainties and also some unsustainable sponsorships from the private sectors, we established own funds in order to make sure we can have our own roadmap and management plans for the whole museum.
那我们的那个主体的博物馆呢，是这个怡园，我们是属于是非营利组织的，是公益的。那么我们有自己的艺术馆建成了之后，我们就在我们的艺术馆之下，我们就有自己的公司，还有建立自己的生意和建立自己的这个产业，还有我们的这个商业的渠道、商业的部门，还有我们的这个一些的地。
So in addition to our memberships to the Chinese Museum Association, which is also a country affiliate of ICOM, we also owned the foundations to which also accommodate some of the assets, especially in the real estate, and also some businesses dealing with the creative industries that would able to provide some revenues to help the museum to sustain itself.
所以我们18年来，我们这样有这个房地产的这个合作者，我们更注重跟那个媒体的合作，还有跟这个我们同时呢跟这个拍卖也要有合作。
In addition to our relationships to the private sectors, we always put emphasis on media communications, which is also important to get a message out to the community and to the different sectors, and also to the industry leaders who are in edge of industries such as design, which is also they have direct supply chains in the whole industry, as well as some businesses dealing with in the art field, such as auction houses or other partners.
那么这样呢，让我们这个18年来到现在为止呢，我们可以有足够的资金去收集很多的艺术品。我们将近到现在呢，我们收集的就是永远不会出售的这种的收藏品，我们将近有700多个作品，那么还有呢，我们还要举行许多的这个文化活动，都是免费的。还有，尤其是我们刚才前面谈到的教育，那么我们也同样的，我们是聘用很多的这个艺术学院的学生来给我们来做这样的一些工作。
So in addition to the permanent collection of around 700 artworks, not only from China but also from overseas, we also provide the free admissions to the whole public, and also programmings for the public, engaging different kind of cultural institutions. So in addition, our partnerships with academic institutions was also beneficial for us to sustain relationships with the art students in art colleges around the nation.
所以我们在这个跟这个媒体合作的同时，我们宣传我们自己的艺术馆，也宣传我们的艺术活动，同时我们也为艺术家还有这些艺术团体来搭建这样的桥梁。我们更多的是寻求我们的合作伙伴。
So besides the role as the traditional sense of museums, we are more likely to build up platforms to help how the cultural leaders, how the artists would able to grow in this platform, and how we can leverage our resources to support them in an efficient way that would able to help them to find the right path to grow professionally.
就像这次7月7号在这个华盛顿举行的1个星期的我们的这次我们来到美国的这个设计展啊，也是跟美国和中国来合作的。那么这个呢是我们完全自己来出资，是因为我们需要搭建这样的桥梁给美国和中国的艺术家，然后我们也希望能寻求在美国能有探讨这样怎么样的一个合作，尤其是艺术馆，还有这个对于艺术家。
In terms of a private and public and private partnerships in the museum itself, we also interested in bring their involvement to the international exchange activities and programming, because that is the area that most private sectors are interested in. So one of the example is that we did Design at Plus exhibitions with the DC Commission on Arts and Humanities and Beijing government to bring most kind of intriguing contemporary designs from both China and DC area designers in order to allow them to have partnerships within their industry. But in that model, a lot of private partners were able to find their interest and also to understand how what level of engagement they can support the museum itself.
所以我们在中国呢有4个地方是我们的分馆，我们也有这个是这样的场地，能够给艺术家安放他们的作品，像北京、云南还有贵州，那个都是有我们的分馆，还有这个纽约的这个古堡也是我们合作的前年第一个合作的一个场地。
So in addition to the general sponsorship that we talked about, we also trying to localize that effort in the certain areas because we found each partners have the special interest in their area or geographically. So we trying to create a hub. We call it a hub of the museum. So for example, we have the presence in Beijing, Kunming, which is the southern part of China, as well as the Guggenheim Estate in New York. Including, and also we put an emphasis on public art, which we partner with the Beijing International Sculpture Center that will welcome international artists to showcase their work to the Chinese audience.
我们那个也是同样的去做这个公共艺术和这个外面的大的雕塑，也接这样的一个设计和这个制作，是因为我们不是说想把爪牙处的有多远，是因为我们想在每一个分布的点能够找到更好的合作者。
And in terms of a public art that she discussed, we also provide a lot of some services for individual artists who want to get some support from, for example, modeling their sculptures from the mold to the bronze. That something that we can engage the industry partners to support those individuals. So those are some lessons we learned from the past experiences.
所以我们一直认为合作者是非常重要，不是我们去从他们身上拿到多少的资金，最主要的是我们是要如何的把这些艺术和这些文化的东西，真正的传入给这些社区，能够进入到社区，让更能够用艺术来解释这样的一个语言和这样的一个意思。然后呢，我们同时呢，我们在寻求合作者的过程中，我们能够有更多的这样的，主要是做项目，而不是仅仅是找一个说一个资金的问题。
So in addition to what I mentioned earlier about the partnerships, in our eyes, the partnerships is not only about financial support, but also, as Andres said, it's about technical support, which could leverage the resources to make sure they could find their new horizon for themselves, for partners, for private partners as well. Or if they're an industry leader, they can find a new business opportunities from our partnerships with the artist community.
所以我们这次呢，也是非常高兴有这么一个平台，能够讨论一下是否我们可以把这样的一个，因为我们也是中国的艺术博物馆的会员，那么是否我们能把这个平台给嫁接好，然后能够通过这一次将来以后能够真正的做到一个中国和这个中国和美国这样的能够有一个互动的这样一个平台。
So as the member of a Chinese Museums Association, as well as the founding member of the China's Association of Collectors, we have the missions to not only promote the Chinese culture to the Americas, but also in order to reinforce its international arm, to embrace the different cultural values and to make sure those practices would able to fall into the same category that everybody could build a partnership in this platform.
然后我们的这个艺术馆的最终的宗旨也是一直要支持教育，尤其我们的艺术馆中一直都有一些这个课外课堂免费的对学生的，而且是有的时候我们更希望的是聘用一些学生，尤其在这次我们的那个展览中，我们就发现很多的困难，就是说我们来到美国之后，我们没有当地的这些学生，或者他们来参与来帮助，其实我们是希望来聘用这样的学生。
And also, we put a lot of emphasis on preservation or conservation practices in art or in culture, and also the community outreach. So, for example, if in the whole culture exchange activities, when we come here to the United States, we're trying to identify who going to be the outreach partners and who can be the volunteers or interns that would able to get involved in this whole process, that they can learn from this valuable experience. So that's why the outreach, the community outreach is one of our emphasis as well.
不仅仅是 volunteer 的，也是要我们会配一些费用。
Oh,
这样
and
的
also
呀
we hired them, not only volunteers.
现在我想就先介绍这些，我希望大家有什么问题可以问我。语言不是障碍，最关键我们能够互相交流的很好
So。this is really kind of brief introduction, and I'm really interested in having the conversations with everyone here. So, yeah. Language is not a barrier, especially in art museum here.
So how many visitors come to the museum in China a year?
大概在中国，就是说 so in the whole museums, statistically, or
Is she representing one museum or?
就是说，如果就是作为金泰艺术馆，每年大概有多少的这个访客到金泰艺术馆？
我们有一年大概有将近10万的访客可以到金泰艺术馆，因为我们还常常组织学校的学生的课堂。Yeah.
So 100,000 people a year annually. This is also not include the students that organize. We call the organized study group that we co-organized with the local schools.
而且我们现在开始了是网上的这个跟 Google 的和中国的这个其他媒体，像这个百度啊、搜狐这样的网上的这样的一个参观和这样的互动。
And also the virtual museums that we talked about is also a trend in China because even though a lot of people build the physical museums and exponentially grow, but also with involvement of Google, but Baidu, and also the large technology companies in China, they build up their platforms to allow the cultural institutions to have virtual tours for the public.
所以我们的10几年的经验，觉得我们觉得跟这个媒体的互动和媒体的合作，还有这个跟学校的合作是非常重要的。
So through our experience, we felt that the relationships with communication sector, the media, as well as the school or education sector is really important to support the value or the mission of the museum itself. So.
Two questions. All right. I have like 57 questions, but I'll do two.
还有2个问题。
So one has to do with these partnerships that you were talking about with the educational institutions. You said that to develop programming for the publics, you develop partnerships with other cultural institutions. I'm interested in hearing you talk about that. That's one. And the other question is about the governance of the museum. So in the United States, the nonprofit model is the dominant model, where there's a board of directors that is responsible for making sure that it's in line with mission. Latin America, that's not the case. How does that work in China for your museum?
大概它有2个问题，一个就是说刚才你提到的，就是说我们经常会去跟一些教育，就是说学校，然后在这种基础上跟一些相应的合作伙伴做一些关于这种艺术教育、文化教育方面的这个活动。他一会儿希望你能多讲一点，这是第一点。那么第2点，他就刚才提到，就是说我们这个博物馆，无论是这个博物馆的这个性质，尤其他可以大体讲一下，就中国博物馆它的这个整体的一种管理的一种模式。它比如说像在美国，它有自己的这个理事会、董事会这个博物馆的，那么在拉美它就没有这样的一个架构跟机制，所以他很想了解一下，在中国来说，这个博物馆的这个管理机制跟这个管理架构大概是怎么样的？
好，我先回答第一个问题，就
She would like
是
to answer the first question.
Yeah,我先回答第一个问题，就是教育。我们呢，我们在每个月都有跟学校的教育课堂，我们定期的在每年举行2次的学生的展览。然后让学生有的时候呢，要定期的学生进入我们的课堂，进入我们的艺术馆来做一些艺术品，然后我们再把他们的艺术品放入我们的市场中。
Okay, so there are 3 different segments of the partnerships with the school and for their curriculum. So first, we conduct monthly tours for our partner schools, and so that include the tours to the museums to see the different exhibitions, and also the conversations with artists themselves. And second, we have with the workshops twice a year. The twice a year is the forum or workshops to encourage the local students artists or the emerging artists to have their own exhibitions at the museum. And also we help them to organize the collectors group and the media and to make sure they can target their certain audience. And third is that we also recruit some of the emerging artists in this platform in order to make sure to sponsor some of their work and work we call commission some of the work, and also we we can spread the word to the nonprofit museums, but also to the commercial galleries, and so before they can make the decision where they want to go professionally.
那么我们在我们自己的活动中呢，我们也请学生过来参加，而且呢，我们会定期的，尤其是像暑期和寒假的这2个休息期间，他们有定期的学生来我们这儿实习，来我们这儿来工作。
And also we have internships and fellowships for both the undergrad students and college or graduate students, and also we offer them the opportunities to get access to the public programs that we offer, or we're partnered with other cultural institutions and embassies.
而且我们一些的像这个设计的一些工作，我们会交给学生去做。
And also when we develop the collateral materials such as brochures, marketing materials, we would allow the participation of the students, because we want them to develop a template for us, and then we can refine it afterwards so they can have that hands-on experience on everything from the beginning.
然后我们通过这样的一个让他们有一个实习的这么一个课堂之后，我们后面他们毕业之后，我们会挑选出一些优秀的来作为我们的职员来用。
And after all those experiences in the summer and winter, we'll make sure whether we will hire them or make recommendations for them to the other institutions. Yeah.
第2个问题就是在中国的这个博物馆的管理方式呢，是因为我们是私人的，所以我们自己呢就是自己来管理。因为在中国和美国可能不同，在中国有两种，一种是私人的博物馆，那么私人博物馆政府是不给1分钱资助的，你要自己去找办法去生存。那么我们就要去想办法去生存。第2种呢是政府的博物馆，那么政府的博物馆他们受到很大的限制，就是如果你们做什么样的合作，做什么样的连接，或者做什么样的活动，都要去上报政府的部门。那么政府是100%给资金的，这个部分的管理呢，他们只做自己的这个博物馆的部分，不做其他的交流。
So in terms of regarding your second questions about the governance of the museums in China, so there are 2 types of museums in China. So first, the state-owned or the government-owned museums, not only in the capital city, but also we have provincial museums. So they receive the funds from government, and also, but they have really they have the restrictions in programming. So, for example, if they're trying to partner with international institutions, they want to get endorsement from Ministry of Culture or other provincial and agencies to get that approved. And also the private museum, which is, in our case, is more like artist-funded museum, and then the category that you talked about. So the government don't supply or provide any financial support to this kind of museums because it is really new in China, and a lot of private museums in China now are sponsored by private collectors or corporates, corporate collection. So that's why government don't have that mechanisms to take initiative to provide any financial support to the institution. So in terms of the private museums here, we don't have a really clear governance structure because So
it can be variable.
It's variable in a case-by-case basis.
我更喜欢我们自己，虽然经营困难，虽然自己经营会累一些，但是我更喜欢我们有更大的自由度。
but this have a lot of challenging and risk because we don't have really solid governance structure as the American do. But we also have some flexibilities.
When you say artist funded, are you saying that there are wealthy artists who are funding and sponsoring museums?
就是刚才就是说提到我们的博物馆是艺术家自己独资盖的，那么你谈到的是不是更多是那种就是非常的大家的艺术家，他自己很有钱，然后他自己盖了这个？
大家的艺术家属于自己经营自己的艺术，他成为大家。
So yeah, this is the rich artist, but also the master in the field. But also he felt the obligations to serve the other emerging artists in the field. So he's not.
我们的馆长呢，就是刚才说到那个袁锡坤先生，他也是经营了30年，他经营自己的艺术，经营成大家。
So he started with his own art career, and then he collected different antiques from overseas and built his own collection. And then he built a museum and served the other art career.
I have a question. You mentioned that one of the sources of funding for the Xintai Museum is it's linked to the creative industries. I don't know if you could explain a little bit more of how that works and what type of industries and how that's channeled back to the museum.
他大概想让你，因为刚才你提到了，就是说作为博物馆，那么它的一个就是说一个回收点，就是说它的一个这种资金的回流，来自于跟一些创新的产业、新创新的行业的合作。那么就是说，Andreas 先生就非常想了解一下，就是说，能不能大概解释一下你的这个创新领域包括哪些内容？这是第一点。第二点就是说，它的回流怎么能够很直接的回馈于博物馆，它的这个关系。
是这样，因为我们的博物馆呢是个人盖的，那我们个人呢就是有土地的征收，我们就开始就有这个土地的去买，还有房地产的买卖，还有我们自己的商场的这种。
是创新这一块儿，这个你刚才说的只是土地，你应该说创新，就是说像动画就这些东西。
动漫我们现在才开始，我们创新的部分是开始的是动漫，我们要拍摄这样的作为动漫电影这样的，然后我们来通过这样的回收来回收到我们自己，因为我们是投资者也是回收者，所以我们就有充足的资金去自己去支持自己。我们过去一直10几年以来都是用自己的商场和自己的土地，还有自己的出租的房屋，还有商业的还有我们的那个公共艺术的订货来这样来帮助我们自己的艺术馆。
So in terms of creative feels that because she didn't clear it about creative because she only talked about the real estate thing that we have the businesses that could have a revenue streams for the museum itself, but also she talked. Yes, so so the creative. So that's why we have a strong interest, and we are the believer of creative economy. We call it orange economy. So because we are involved in the animation. And because a lot of early stage creative development of animation requires the involvement of artists, and as well as the graphic designers. So we supply those talents, we call the human capital, to those animated films or different kind of production, and to leverage those international platforms to allow them to exchange ideas with large studios only in the early stage. Because that requires the creative development. So we are not in the place to get involved in their post-productions or production itself, but more creative development. And through that process, we are able to get our words out and also could play the role in bridging those understanding and delivering effective culture messages through a different medium, not only about art, but also the different medium. And the second one is about public art and design. Because design, for example, is not only talk about art itself, but also involves industry design, involves the commercial value of the art itself. So through that process, we work with the dealers, with the galleries, and to make sure those artists would able to to communicate with the industry leaders in overseas. So those are two simple examples.
所以我们可以说是比较多元的这种的艺术的各种界别，我们都会触及。
So through all this kind of experiences, we identified several or 2 or 3 priorities that we can invest in, and to make sure it can be sufficient models for the museum.
So let's take some questions from the audience. Gretchen.
I have two questions.
大概是这样。
One is, I was just wondering, it seems as though in the discussion that museums are more or less equated with art museums. And I'm wondering about the growth of science museums, history museums, natural history museums, in addition to art museums in both of the areas that the speakers have covered. And then I guess the second question is, I'm wondering if you're finding the same patterns of visitation as we generally have in the United States, which is well-educated people, and what efforts, are there any more efforts original to your own cultures to bring in people that are not the usual museum goers in the United States?
他大概问了2个问题，一个问题就刚才我们谈到的博物馆，可能更多的只局限于艺术博物馆。那么他想就是让大家一会儿在讨论的过程中谈一下关于这个博物馆的这个定义，其中也包括自然博物馆、科学博物馆、人文博物馆，它里面包括的这个科目是不一样的。那么这个博物馆的定义，那么第二点就是说，在整个一个这样的一个交往中，无论是拉美、美国还是中国。在这样就是说，他们自己的这种经历是怎么能够让一些不去博物馆的人到最后就去，因为它是本身是一个培育的这么一个过程。所以，maybe we can start.
All right, fine, I'll start. You're right. I don't know why we tend to gravitate towards art museums, except that they're the best kinds of museums. No, but in the numbers I cited of the tremendous growth in museums in Latin America, that includes historical sites, includes museums of science, includes technology museums. Now, a lot of this. So, in my categories of private collections, the private collections started by wealthy business people. Most of them are art museums. They're private art collections and art museums. The corporate museums, many of them are science museums, science and technology museums. And one example, is in Bio in Costa Rica. They tend to be a museum plus something else. So a museum plus educational center, but sort of a standalone educational center and laboratory as well. So there's certainly a lot of that. But the biggest explosion has been in the realm of art museums. There's also been a parallel explosion in the realm of historical sites and historical and natural heritage sites, so open air museums. So those are the two big trends. The museum visitorship, that's really interesting because it's a completely different conception of what it means to visit a museum and who goes to a museum. Practically every school child in every of the countries will have visited these museums. There's a rise in children's museums as well, exponential rise in children's museum. It used to be that children's museum was the museum Ciudad de los Niños, City of the Children in La Plata in Argentina, and that was it. Now there's children museums, significant children museums everywhere. The museums that thrive and that have a lot of people going to them are museums that think of themselves not just as a place to exhibit art, but as a nexus for community formation. So that are a place for people to hang out, that are a place that is welcoming to people. So I want to turn this over to someone else, but I'll give you one really quick example. The Pinacoteca of Sao Paulo, which is the museum of the city of Sao Paulo, and it's an art museum. The person who runs it, Marcelo, noticed that it's near an old train station in the central part of Sao Paulo. There's a beautiful park around it. Most of the people who live around that area are people of lower income. And he noticed that they weren't visiting the museum. They would go to the park, they would sit on the steps, but not actually make it through the door. Right? And the people who would visit it would be tourism. And there's a lot of, by the way, initiatives around increasing visitorship among tourists to museums, not necessarily local populations. So what he did was got shipping containers, those big metal boxes, and set them out throughout the park and put some of the museum objects in those shipping containers with museum docents, staff, volunteers out there in the park. right? As a way to slowly start drawing in people to what they could expect to the museum, and actually manage to finally get them past the door and visiting to the museum. So yes, there's initiatives in that sense as well.
我们的做法呢是在中国的做法呢，可能有所不同。我们是更多的做一些跟这个主题有关系的活动，之后呢，我们用网上或者是电话去通知别人来参加，然后，这个活动的主题更能够让他们有参与感，共同的一起动手。
So in China, we also see an emerging role of natural museums, technology museums, and also really specific industry-specific museums. But those don't call them museums. We call them more like a hub because they're not strong enough to, because they don't have a really strong curriculum. They don't have a really strong and comprehensive collection. So that's why they don't treat themselves as the 100% museum. In terms of the communication, the community formation we got a similar approach to engage the public, especially people don't have that awareness to go to the museum to see the exhibition, until the point that we engage the social media and how the people publicize it. If that is really exciting, people will go. Otherwise, people won't go. So it's the same thing in China.
所以我们会有这个，我们虽然是这个是的确需要资金的，那么我们会有小学生的、中学生的，还有这个大学生的活动。我们让他们来参与之后，我们就会有不同的这个 session 给他们，然后我们会有不同的东西给他们。
So it is different from the K-12 curriculum that we have here in the States. We separate the community of youngsters are into 3 different groups. There can be primary students, middle school students, and high school students. And all the museums design the different curriculums for 3 different groups. So they don't have a really kind of one single plan for all of them. Yeah.
So one of the things that I have noticed just primarily in the presentations that have been made at the AM annual meeting. It's a series called Lessons from the International Community, which brings together people from outside the United States to talk about innovative case studies, is that we've seen, just picking up on what Jimena said, is that, and my observation is that in Latin and South America, museums tend to be much more community-focused and community centers. And there have been examples, for instance, in Mexico, there is a museum which actually brings actually artwork into the homes of families so that they can actually experience it and so that they can actually become familiar with the whole notion of a museum. Likewise, what I was really surprised about when I visited China and was in Beijing was I was so surprised at the number of visitors who came to the museum as families or with others, and really used it as an opportunity to take pictures with photos. So the photos were the backdrop, and this was simply an opportunity for people to be socially engaged, but to sort of be in the center of the story. And I found that really very, very fascinating. So other questions from the audience? Yes.
Yes, my name is Antonio Rodriguez. I'm curious about what other ways of partnerships between museums you see, not only in Latin America, but also in China, because traditionally the way museums work together is probably traveling exhibitions, exchanging exhibitions, maybe educational programs, but besides those 2 or 3 traditional topics, do you perceive any other trends, any other areas of
China?
我觉得是有的。我们需要共同的去设计一个项目。如果这个项目是共同的，那么我们就可以有共同的事情，不仅仅是换展。我们需要搭建平台。
So the tour exhibitions exchange our cultural activities or exchanging exhibitions are the traditional method or approach that we doing with the different museums, and also that's what the China support wants to do, and also they that's the traditional methods, and people don't want to think that creatively because some of the programs take a lot of risks and without knowing what happened overseas. So that's why in terms of public and private partnerships, we more encourage the people to not only do an exhibition because it's really short term, unless it provides the residence programs for the artists. Otherwise, it's really short term. So encourage the people to would able to do some pilot projects around the collection itself or the art initiative, so the people were able to participate and to understand what kind of partnerships they can build before they build a long-term partnership.
因为
public
因为那个
partnerships in China.
因为换展览最终的目的是让艺术家的他的作品是有买卖的或者有去处的，有的去博物馆的收藏，有的是在 galleries 的买卖，或者是在 action 的上面的买卖。我们是要搭建这样的平台之后，在展览之后要有这样的一个渠道。
Since tour exhibitions not only enrich and foster a kind of educational and cultural enrichment experiences for the audience, but also the artists themselves have a specific goals of doing or joining that program. So someone they want to, yes. So we're more like the partnerships need to become a facilitator for those individuals.
最主要打开这样的双方的渠道，这个是很重要的。
So that's what she means.
Yeah, and I said no, programming and education for the public, but one kind of partnership I've seen in Latin America is partnerships for education of the staff. So where it's not affordable to bring one person to train people in one museum in conservation, that several museums will get together to bring that person to train them in conservation exhibitions. Jessica, did you have something to add?
That actually, the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts in Richmond just launched a partnership with the Palace Museum in Beijing, and they're doing professional development exchanges with curators and educators switching between the two museums. So that's another example of partnerships.
他大概讲了一个，就是说这个维吉尼亚的一个博物馆跟国内一个博物馆，就是建立了，就是不是换展，但是更多的是在这种专业行业性的这种互换的这种培训。
So my question, getting to the issue of training, is both in China and in Latin America. First of all, in China, I'm curious to know how, in fact, what kind of backgrounds the staff that are working in the museum have training in, and where, in fact, does Ms. Lee see the greatest need for training, in what areas?
就说他想从这个金台博物馆的这个角度来看的话，就是说这个人员都是从前都接受了哪些的这个专业的培训，这是第一点。第二点，因为他刚才讨论了这个专业行业的培训，那么第二点就是说，在你看来，你认为中国现在博物馆最缺的是哪类的培训？它里面分不同的这个培训的这个领域，所以在你看来，这个是怎么划分的？
我们过去所使用的人员呢，就是如果是设计部分，就是设计专业；如果是博物馆收藏，我们是博物馆收藏专业的人士。然后呢就是都是行业中毕业的。那么专业的布展的话呢，是有策展人。那么如果是我们现在缺的培训，是我们上次讨论过这个问题。我们目前中国比较缺的就是国际上的交流，文化的就是艺术的交流和艺术市场的部分是比较缺的，尤其是国际艺术市场部分是相当缺的。
So for the Jingtai itself, we have in-house staffings. They're trained staffings for exhibition design, communications, curation, or it can be more like a programming, or she can be the curator. But what mostly the Chinese museums want more training programs covering the different fields, especially with marketing, marketing and communications, the international outreach, because a lot of people don't speak English or other languages in art and culture field, so they need to outsource the talents to help them to facilitate those dialogue. And third, it's more about how to engage the community outreach or education component. So it's really kind of three different elements and components in that training field that we're looking to.
I have one last question, because actually we have to go down for lunch, but I think it's a good question to wrap up in terms of what the Jintai Museum is doing. The Jintai Museum and Professor has been traveling to Latin America quite intensively. So I'm just curious to see what would the next step be in terms of exchanges and partnerships with Latin America, if the Jintai Museum is looking to move forward in that sense and develop partnerships with Latin American museums.
Wow, so strategically. Well, 他刚才就问到一个问题就是说，因为他知道这个袁先生经常去这个拉美，然后他现在也在拉美，所以呢，也提到了袁先生想在这个拉美去跟拉美的一些文化机构建立合作。所以在您这个看来，作为国际部主任，作为艺术馆的这个长期战略来说，我们是想怎么跟拉美的这个文化机构合作？是通过哪些方面合作？
挺有挑战性的这么一个问
Really
题
challenging
啊。
question.
我相信我们艺术馆的一个战略的话，是因为我们10几年来搭建了这个拉美的这个艺术互动，我们希望跟这个拉美的文化还有艺术有一个全面的一个合作。那么我们袁先生的意思呢，就是立足于美国这边，因为这是美国拉美的部分，更多的来到这边，就像这边有一个拉美的中心，现在他正在拉美那边在访问，但是呢，毕竟是每个国家，这样真是把人累死，所以呢，最好有一个中心的地方可以发射出去所有的国家。在这里立足吧。
So the first of all, the recent visit of Mr. Yuan to Central America. So the goal for his visit is to understand the different cultural landscapes, not only in Latin America, in those large cities, Brazil, Argentina, Colombia, Venezuela, but also include those smaller countries such as Puerto Rico, so Dominican Republic. So they have a really kind of regional cultural perspectives, and also they have a different approach, especially in kind of cultural exchanges. So his goal, the goal of the visit is to understand cultural landscape. So and for partnerships with Latin American institutions and even artists, individual artists, the goal is to not only cover the art itself, but also the humanities. So that's why we partner with DC Commission on Arts and Humanities, because that also covers some history. We require the art historian could get involved in these partnerships, and also the people who are in the literature could provide solid informations for the art exchanges and cultural dialogue.
因为我们
That
相
is
信，
one layer that we're
因为
looking
我们相
into.
信，在一个小的国家放出一个声音，全世界不知道。但是我们要在这个地方放出一个声音，或者大家能在一个平台上对话或者合作，能够推动一些文化的进程。我们相信全世界都会知道。
So the reason why we bring a sculpture exhibit to the AMA since May is because we realize that we share a similar value to not only to promote Chinese culture here in the United States or to the Americas, but also to embrace the heritage, because we see there's a lot of similarities between Latino or Hispanic culture as well as Chinese culture. So we're trying to embrace that values together. That's why we think AMA is going to be a good destination to understand that values and to diversify those voices to those Latin American countries. So.